Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it is Thursday, March the 27th, 2025. A couple of years ago, I did a live event in San Francisco about homelessness. Of course, San Francisco is the, so to speak, poster child of the homeless crisis in the United States, with a writer-activist, Kevin Adler. He, at the time, had a new book out, When We Walk By, Forgotten Humanity, Broken Systems, and the Role We Can Each Play in Ending Homelessness in America. And then earlier in March, I did another show on homelessness with another San Francisco-based writer, Kevin Fagan, a journalist. He has an acclaimed new book out, The Lost and the Found, a true story of homelessness, found family, and second chances. And it's a book about the homeless and, I guess, the found of San Francisco. Today, we are continuing the theme, although we're switching coasts. We're focusing on Atlanta, Georgia, and we're addressing a different problem of homelessness, the working homelessness. There's a new book out, another acclaimed book, There Is No Place for Us, by my guest, Brian Goldstone, who lives in Atlanta and is broadcasting from there today. Brian, congratulations on the new book. I'm sure you've read all these books about homelessness in San Francisco, California, Los Angeles. Is what you're writing about in your book, which focuses on the story of 5 families in Atlanta, how do you compare and contrast your kind of book from, say, Kevin Fagan's book? I'm sure you've had a chance to look at it, The Lost and the Found.
Sure. Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I think one way that I would distinguish what this book is trying to document and reveal, in contrast to not just Kevin's book, but I think most of the reporting that has been done on the housing and homelessness crisis in America, is, one thing I'm trying to argue in the book is that what we see on the street, as bad as it is, to be frank, as devastating as the reality of unsheltered street homelessness has become in America, it's only the tip of the iceberg. And what my book is trying to document is everything that lies under the water surface, the rest of that iceberg that we don't see. And what lies under the water surface, so to speak, is not just some marginal phenomenon. It's not just a bizarre aberration. It's actually the overwhelming majority of people experiencing homelessness in America. Families, overwhelmingly families with children, who they are not only visible on the street, but they don't fit any of the kind of stereotypes that many people in this country have about people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, when I was researching your book, I looked at all the marketing for Atlanta, and it's very glossy. I actually was in Atlanta a couple of months ago. There's not a lot of homelessness on the streets of Atlanta. These cities, these secondary cities, I guess, of homelessness, I'm not sure if that's the right word, they do a pretty good job hiding it, although I guess it's not a formal process, is it?
Well, as far as street homelessness in America is concerned, our policy as a country has largely consisted of pushing it out of sight and out of mind. So cities like Atlanta, where you don't see perhaps as many tent encampments, for instance, as you might see in Southern California or in San Francisco or Seattle, that is not necessarily because there are fewer people struggling with housing insecurity and homelessness in Atlanta, it's because it has simply been either pushed out of view, or as is the case with many families with children, uh, they're going their homelessness is experienced in very different ways, in very different kinds of places, like in their cars and with in the crowded apartments of friends and relatives. And one really crucial kind of location that I ended up writing about in the book, and where I sort of embedded myself for over a year, is an extended stay hotel. These hotels and motels have been proliferating not only across Georgia, but really across the country. And I try to show that this is a new frontier for not only housing insecurity, or I should say, those who have been pushed over the edge out of the formal rental and housing market into this more informal space. And they're incredibly exploitative, these places. They're very expensive, and that's where most of our sort of homeless families.
So tell me the economics.
Yeah.
I don't mean to sound vulgar here,
Sure.
Brian, but if a family can afford to stay at a place like the Efficiency Lodge, for people watching, it's a
Mhm.
photo of one of these extended stay hotels in Georgia. Why can't they afford housing?
Yeah, it's really not that they can't afford housing in many cases. It's that, so to give you an example, one of the families I follow in the book, my book follows 5 different families here in Atlanta, and each of their stories kind of illuminates a different aspect of this larger phenomenon of the dramatic rise of what I call the working homeless in cities across America. One family who I follow in the book, they were stably housed. They were renting a single family home, and their landlord was a private equity firm, a very large private equity firm, who, when their house burned down, the house was burned down by an abusive ex of the mother. This family, they went. The Red Cross put them up in a hotel for a while. And she sort of began her search for a new place to live. Now, in that process, she discovered about 2 or 3 months after the house burned down, when she went to apply for another apartment, she had the money to pay for a new apartment because she worked at a warehouse, and it was much more expensive than it had been even a couple of years earlier, but she had the money. What she discovered was that this private equity firm landlord had filed an eviction against her on a house that had been burned down, that was no longer habitable. And her credit score had been tanked as a result. Now, in Georgia, she didn't even have to be notified that this eviction had been filed against her. And I argue that, what pushed this family into homelessness was not the fire itself, as dramatic as it was. It was a basic lack of tenant protections that could allow someone to be evicted from a home that's literally no longer standing. It was that credit score being tanked that effectively barred her from renting another apartment, and it trapped her and her family in this squalid extended stay hotel for over a year.
Sounds a dreadful story, but is it typical?
The fire itself is not typical, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
So you've thrown in all the stuff that offends, but I'm sure myself and most of our audience, private equity, nameless private equity, probably owned by some billionaire somewhere or other. But is that really typical that there was a fire, and then they for one reason or other pinned the woman with an eviction, even though she had no choice but to leave?
No, I mean, again, the fire is a sensational moment in her story. What is typical is that uh, poor and working class families across this country have very low credit scores for
Right.
various reasons. It could be medical debt. It could be a failure to pay student loans back on time because your wages are barely able to pay your light bill or to put food on the table. So, there's a crisis of low credit in this country. And in America, a 3-digit number has increasingly come to determine whether you can access one of the most basic human necessities, which is a roof overhead. And so, yes, it's true that the fire, like I say, is a kind of dramatic instance, and that's why I'm at pains to show, I think, in the reporting, that it was not the fire that led to them becoming homeless. It was, it was a basic lack of tenant protections. And that lack of tenant protections extends to any number of scenarios that are far less dramatic.
Brian, your book follows 5 families. Numbers are always significant in these kind of books. All sorts of numbers about the numbers of homeless in America. Obviously, those numbers don't really mean anything unless you're homeless. How do you quantify this problem? I've heard numbers like 4 million of working homeless. Is that accurate?
Well, there is no single data source because, and this is part of the phenomenon itself, when I say that the people I'm writing about in this book are part of an entire population of Americans who are not just invisible, but who have been rendered invisible. This has been an active production of invisibility because the government very deliberately does not count these families. Every year when the homeless census is conducted, none of the families who I write about in this book are counted. Having said that, the Department of Education does count students, school children living in hotels, for instance, as homeless. They count children doubled up or tripled up with other families as homeless, living in their cars. So the Department of so basically how I got to that 4 million, or what I argue is about 6 times, a conservative estimate, 6 times what the federal homeless census tells us, is by cobbling together the Department of Education numbers, which is only for school children, and combining that with some kind of cutting edge research conducted by researchers at Vanderbilt University and the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless that counts the number of families, including children, who are doubled up with others in sort of precarious living situations, which again is considered homeless by the Department of Education.
So what we're talking about approximately, Brian, is about 1% of Americans. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is right.
You talk, and I'm requoting this phrase, an active production of invisibility. Of course, everybody knows the book Invisible Man, which was very much bound up in race. Is this the new race issue, homelessness, or people like the families you follow in this book who are essentially invisible in this America of the 2020s?
Yeah, Atlanta is, it's often called the Black Mecca. It's a place where the civil rights movement was birthed, and it's the birthplace of Dr. King. Atlanta prides itself on being a place where Black Americans can not just survive but thrive, and yet in this birthplace of the civil rights movement, which is no longer majority Black, by the way, that status changed several years ago. Atlanta is no longer a majority Black city, but 93% of families experiencing homelessness in Atlanta are Black. And that has a history.
Wow, that's an astonishing. I mean, this is the 93% of your working homeless or everyone?
It varies by region in this country. There are parts of the country where I've reported in Northern California. I wrote a magazine article based in Salinas, California, where a large portion of the working homeless population were farm workers, immigrant farm workers or naturalized farm workers and their families who were living in their vans and living in these sort of safe parking lots and going to work the next morning. So it does vary by region. In Minnesota, a huge proportion of families and individuals who are homeless are indigenous or Native American. So, but there is, I think, racism baked into all of those kinds of.
My question wasn't so much about the racism, was that this. I'm not suggesting that racism in America has gone away, but this is the new divide, whereas the race divide was the thing that shaped perhaps the early history and even the 20th century pre-civil rights history of the United States. Mm-hmm. So this is the new division between those who are housed and those who aren't.
That's right. I think that is a division. I also would suggest that the line separating the housed from the unhoused is more porous than it's ever been, and that the very term "working homeless" suggests that that we need to rethink both.
Yeah, although I mean, at one point, where do you where do you I don't know what the word is. Where do you sort of cut off the definition? I mean, if someone gets a job and they can't afford their own place, so they got to live at home. I mean, there are huge amounts of young people now who have returned home. There are some middle-aged people who have gone to live with their elderly parents. So this is more than just people living in the efficiency lodges on the outskirts of Atlanta. This is a national problem, isn't it?
Yeah. When we use terms like couch surfing or, crashing at somebody else's house for a bit, I'm not talking here about, college students who are working at McDonald's and they can't afford their own apartment, so they're still living with their parents. I'm talking about to give another example from the book, a woman named Kara who is an EKG tech at Grady Hospital, the public hospital here in Atlanta. And when she gets off of her shift at the hospital, she goes not to an apartment, but sleeps in her car with her children in a Walmart parking lot, folding her hospital scrubs very carefully in the trunk of her car and washing her children in the morning before they go to school in the bathroom at this Walmart, and then going to work.
How much, speaking of that woman, Brian, this is astonishing, really, but how much is this woman earning? I mean, she has a full-time job at a hospital.
Yeah. So she worked so many jobs in the course of this book that I forget what each wage was, but I believe when she got promoted to this EKG tech position, she was making about $13 an hour, which for her was
it's minimum, pretty much minimum wage.
Well, no, minimum wage here in Georgia is $7.25 an hour, which is the federal minimum wage.
Yeah, well, California, yeah.
So she's making almost double the minimum wage.
And the kids are going to school. So she's dropping them at school, picking them up, and then they're all sleeping in the car every night.
Yeah, or cycling between the car. And when she can save enough money to get them into a hotel room for the night, they sleep in the hotel room. And when she has to pay for her phone, her cell phone bill, or the kids need to go to the doctor, or any number of other things arise, then they're back in the car. They're trying to get into a homeless shelter. So yeah, and if I could just return to that question about the hotels, because I think there is a kind of misperception that, okay, people are staying in hotels. What's the big deal? How is that homelessness? And, I would, to anyone who asks that, I would say, go visit one of these hotels. These places, the living conditions in these places are absolutely abysmal. We're talking about rodents, mold. One family in the book is living in a hotel like this. And in the course of 8 months, because they too have been pushed out of the formal rental market when their landlord decided not to renew their lease so that she could sell the property, they end up in one of these extended stay hotels, and they spend $17,000 in 8 months on their hotel room with their 3 children. Next door, an apartment would have cost maybe half of that. But again, they refer to this room as their expensive prison because they can't get back into that formal rental market. And the companies who own these hotels are preying on the desperation of people who, without this room, would be on the street. And so they can extort them, in effect, for as much money as they want.
Did you see the movie The Florida Project, which is,
yes.
I'm not sure. I mean, it was obviously a dramatization of what you're writing about.
Yeah.
But that was in Florida. I'm guessing that cities like Miami, Fort Lauderdale are similar in this sense to a place like Atlanta.
Yeah, I thought that was a wonderful movie. What was missing, as human as that film was, and as beautiful as it was, what was missing was a larger analysis of why is it that these families are living at these hotels, not for days or weeks, but and not even months, but for years. Why are school buses pulling up to these hotels to pick up the dozens of children who live there? We need that kind of analysis to understand how these places have become, in effect, extremely profitable homeless shelters.
Yeah, and it's for people who don't know, the Florida Project's a 2017 movie by Sean Baker. He just won an Oscar for Anora. It's an excellent film about families living in Florida. What about the urban rural division, Brian? In poorer rural areas, I don't know, Kentucky, Mississippi, elsewhere in the Midwest. Are we seeing the same problems, or is this particularly a feature of urban America, of places like Atlanta?
One statistic that I have cited in many talks that I've given and in conversations with people, and I cite it in the book, and as many times as I've cited it, it never ceases to shock me. And that comes from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which is that there is not a single city, state, or county in the U.S. right now where someone earning the local minimum wage is able to afford the median a median price 2-bedroom apartment in that particular city, state, or county. So in other words, if you're in California where the minimum wage is higher than here in Atlanta, even someone making that minimum wage, it would not be able to afford a median price 2-bedroom apartment. So the idea that you could just leave one of these more expensive cities like San Francisco or New York and go somewhere cheaper is increasingly becoming not feasible. There simply aren't many places left in this country where someone can afford an apartment on their low wage earnings.
A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with the Atlantic editor, Yoni Applebaum, Stuck, How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. This represents the other end, I guess, of our housing crisis. I'm not sure. I'm sure you've read some of the stuff that Applebaum and other Atlantic writers have written on this. Is this a piece, the sort of the bottom end, so to speak, of the housing crisis in America? The rich, the prosperous aren't moving. The very nature of laws in states like California are so aggressively directed against new building that it's ultimately the working poor who you describe in your book who are the victims of all this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would add to that that the people I'm writing about in this book and who I believe are representative of, as we mentioned some of those numbers earlier, not hundreds of thousands, but millions of people in this country, they are the casualties of the rapid growth, the redevelopment, the revitalization of many cities in America, including Atlanta. So in other words, as these cities boom, the families I'm writing about are being pushed out of their neighborhoods that they grew up in and increasingly pushed out of housing altogether. When you put it in, the problem is not only housing, because Atlanta has built a lot of new apartments, unlike a city like, say, San Francisco, where there's so much red tape to build a single apartment. Apartments are going up everywhere in the city. And yet, over the last 5 years, the city of Atlanta, or I'm sorry, Metro Atlanta, has lost over 200,000 affordable housing units. So the units that are going up are largely luxury apartments and condos. And that is doing nothing to help the families who I'm writing about.
Although there is an argument put forward by people like Applebaum, Ezra Klein has a new book about this, and we've done a number of shows, that cities like Houston represent an alternative model to, I'm not sure if I've read anything on Atlanta, but certainly the Houston, San Francisco or Houston, Los Angeles comparison for some people suggests that that local cities should be building, and that some of the laws against building have been disastrous for local communities.
To be sure, I think that's right, and I push against a kind of either or sensibility when it comes to this question, that it's either a matter of building more housing or it's something else. I think that that's important. It is important to increase supply. But what is often missing from the discussion about just building or deregulating the housing market, allowing developers to just do their thing, allow the private market to do its thing, is the question of power, the power asymmetry that exists between those who are fortunate enough to own property and to be a landlord in this country, and the many, many, many more who are dependent on those people for a place to live, is pretty drastic. And until we address that power asymmetry, I think we can build as much as we want, and it may help a little bit, but it won't address the root cause of this homelessness crisis, I believe.
Yeah, you had an interesting op-ed in the New York Times on this subject. This is actually how I came across the book. America is pushing its workers into homelessness, and you conclude with what you say is the need for a fundamental shift in how we think about housing. But in Trump's America, in all seriousness, I don't want to talk too much about Trump, Brian. I'm sure you're sick of hearing about him too. Is what you're talking about even vaguely realistic? I mean, even in Biden's America or Obama's America, this issue never really was addressed. So it's all very well talking about this deep structural changes of wealth and power, but where do you begin? What is feasible in 2025 America?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important to note that my reporting on this book, the suffering that this book documents, the predicament that the families I'm writing about find themselves in, it began during the first Trump administration. It continued through the Biden administration, and now it's continuing into the second Trump administration. The circumstances of those I wrote about stayed the same. The what I referred to earlier is the production of invisibility is a bipartisan project. It's something that that politicians across the aisle have participated in, going back to, for instance, Bill Clinton's welfare reform, which was decisive for many of the families I'm writing about, and sort of forcing people into the labor market who otherwise would have received government assistance, and pushing them into low-wage jobs that were not enough to take care of their most basic necessities. So this has been a bipartisan, not to put too fine a point on it, but a bipartisan abandonment of working poor people in this country. Having said that, you're right. What we're seeing now with this current administration is horrifying. It's
I mean, you mentioned the education department earlier. I mean, that's in the process of being dismantled. Of course, DOGE is cutting a lot of the services, which I'm guessing the subjects in your book are dependent on.
Absolutely. I mean, it's terrifying to witness an already threadbare safety net just being shredded with a machete. And so, to your question,
literally and metaphorically, that machete.
Yes, Elon Musk with his chainsaw. So to your question of, isn't this all just hopelessly, idealistic? To be one metaphor someone used recently that I thought captured this is talking about treating housing as a fundamental right in America today, akin to talking about decorating your living room while someone is stripping all of the wire out of the wall. It's like, is this just completely out of touch? And to that, I would respond, there is obviously a need to attend to the emergency that, the current administration is talking about rounding homeless people up and putting them into camps. So,
yeah, that's what I was actually, sorry to jump in here. Given what they're behaving now with immigrants, or supposed illegal immigrants, whatever you want to call them, I'm guessing that I wouldn't be surprised with someone within the Trump administration, or certainly Vance, if he becomes president, sort of taking that story and adding your working homeless underclass and saying, well, these people aren't really contributing. They're trashing up our cities, so we're going to throw them out. Although I don't know where they'd send them.
Just to clarify, you're talking about the people like the working homeless that they could be targeted by.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I think that's true. But I think there's also a how do I put it? There's a reluctance, I think, to acknowledge the very existence of the phenomenon that I'm writing about, because when we talk about the working homeless, both of those words those words put together are kind of shocking for anyone who still wants to subscribe to the American dream, that if you just work hard enough, you can achieve maybe not wealth, but you can at least have a degree of stability for yourself and your family. And a lot of conservatives and people on the right, they still like to push this idea that if you're homeless, it's because you're not working hard enough. You don't have a job, you're lazy, you're irresponsible. And I'm not trying to suggest that the people I'm writing about don't make bad choices like all of us, or they would be the first ones to point to their own shortcomings. But they are working and working and working some more, and it simply is not enough to have security. So I think I would be interested to see how those who want to demonize people experiencing homelessness would confront the reality of people working full-time jobs and not being able to take care of their most basic need.
The politics of this, of course, are relevant, interesting, troubling. I'm guessing that the 5 subjects of who you followed in the book don't spend a lot of time reading the New York Times or CNN, that they're much too busy living in their cars, feeding their kids. So they don't vote, or if they do vote, they don't vote aggressively. Is that one of the problems, is that the 4 million or ever how many millions of working homeless in this country aren't organized politically?
Yeah, I think that it's not so much, I mean, you're right. I mean, when you are trying to survive and you're trying to ensure that you and your children are not sleeping, in a tent on the sidewalk, what people in Washington are doing is not at the top of mind, right? But the question of organizing, I think, is crucial. And in fact, to get back to your question about how can we be talking about housing as a human right amid what we're seeing today, during the pandemic, it was pretty bleak. Unemployment was at the highest level since the recession of 2008, and there was just widespread pain and immiseration in this country. And in the midst of that arose a really powerful tenant rights movement. It was because of grassroots organizing across the country that an eviction moratorium was declared by the CDC that prevented millions of people who were behind on rent because they were out of work from being allowed to be forced out of their homes. That did not come because someone in Washington woke up and decided to look out for these families. It was because tenants and their allies they called their Congress people, city council, at every level of government, and said, you need to take this crisis seriously. So that gives me hope. What it says to me is that our vision of, and I'm speaking now more as a citizen than a journalist, I suppose, but that our vision of a just and equitable society should not be determined by whatever Trump or any other politician happens to be proclaiming at a particular moment.
Brian, you noted that this was as much a problem in Biden's America as either in Trump 1 or Trump 2. Have the Democratic Party really let down your constituency that you write about in this book? There's obviously a deep crisis now within the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders and AOC are out, trying to redefine, maybe reimagine, or maybe even build a new political force.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing that Sanders and AOC would be in many ways sympathetic with what you're writing about, and certainly wouldn't be surprised with what you found in Atlanta.
And many of the people I wrote about are sympathetic to the message that Bernie and AOC are preaching right now, which is that their party, it's not just the Republicans, it's not just MAGA, that their own party has abandoned the working class and poor in America. And, I remember the day that Biden was elected, and Georgia was turned blue, if you remember. Raphael.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, it was part of the same narrative.
It was
part of the same sentence, right?
Yes, it was a very exciting moment. And I remember in my neighborhood that I live in Atlanta, everyone was celebrating and they all had yard signs. And I drove a couple of miles away to this extended stay hotel where again, much of the book is based. And nobody was talking about the election. Nobody was celebrating. And it occurred to me, the question occurred to me is, how is it that the lives of these people is so fundamentally off the radar of those who were just elected? And I think that question was borne out by the fact that over the next 4 years, again, their circumstances changed very little. And I'm not trying to suggest that they're all the same, that Donald Trump, Biden, that they're all the same, not by any stretch of the imagination. But could that party that says it stands on the side of labor and working people and those who are powering our economy, powering our cities through their work, could they be doing more to protect those families and those children? Absolutely.
I mean, you're, in a sense, Brian, giving these people a voice. You're writing about them. But in the New Deal or in the Great Depression, there were writers, poets, photographers who gave these people a face, a voice. Do we need, I mean, I know this is a softball question for you, but do we need more Florida Project style movies, more books like yours, more American activists of one kind or another to recognize this fundamental reality that is, I mean, to borrow Gore's term, the one of the core inconvenient truths of living in America today?
I don't know if we need this book or we need that movie, but we need something. We need something to awaken us, or I should say, shock us into confronting the reality of what we've allowed this country to become. And when you have roughly 4 million men, women, and children in this country who have been deprived of one of the most basic human necessities, something is really broken and really wrong, especially when it's the richest country on the planet. So do we need this book? I hope that when readers confront not my analysis and not my arguments, but when they confront the lived reality of what these people are living through and what these children are living through, the ways that this is shaping the future of these children through, public health researchers use a term called toxic stress to characterize the ways that children's behavioral health, physical ailments can be determined, things like asthma, ADHD, things that can really affect your educational outcomes way into the future are shaped by these moments of precarity and uncertainty as children, not knowing where you're going to be sleeping when you leave school every day. Something has to happen for us to awaken to that reality. We certainly have enough money to buy fighter jets or any number of other things. Why are we allowing this most basic human necessity to be auctioned off to the highest bidder? And why is housing allowed to be treated as a commodity that is an asset class or an investment vehicle for some and is sort of out of reach for many, many more?
Yeah, this is the truth of, I mean, some people call this new class a precariat, sort of the next chapter in the history of the proletariat. Finally, Brian, you got a PhD in anthropology from Duke University. You taught at Columbia University. You're now really dedicated to writing about this. Is your life, in a sense, a model for people who perhaps might be wasting their time within the university, which is also coming under assault from the Trump administration? Do more journalists need to get out there and actually see what's happening in America?
I certainly wouldn't hold myself up as any kind of
example. I'm not trying to iconify you, turn you into an angel or anything. But I mean, what you're doing is important. In the same way as Kevin Fagan, another journalist on the Chronicle, is doing. So, the only way that people are going to hear about this is when books, movies, TV shows come out about it.
Absolutely. I mean, I do want more journalists and academics, frankly, to get into the streets, and not in my case into the streets, but into these extended stay hotels, into these Walmart parking lots and so forth. Go to the food pantries, go to the plasma centers where families are, where adults are selling their plasma in order to pay their light bill. Go to those places. We need reporting on that. We need more stories on that. And we need more podcasts that are willing to raise these issues. So I do appreciate very much your willingness to go there.
Well, that is America, unfortunately. In 2025, Brian Goldstone's new book, There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America, is an essential read for anyone who I think wants to understand the reality of this country in 2025. It gets beyond all the hysteria about Trump and actually sees what's really happening. Brian, congratulations, if that's the right word on the book. Continue the good work. And this is not a subject that will go away. We'll have to get you back on the show to talk more policy issues, and I'm sure you'll have some other interesting projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. This was a pleasure.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keene. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He is the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew Keene, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.